Okay, let me start off with introduction. That not only am I not an expert on the laws of baking matzahs, I'm not a novice or even a beginner, and I'm just here to share you some of my general knowledge, which is maybe interesting, but it's not halachically based. So don't ask me any complicated halachic questions about baking matzahs. That's not the point. Okay, so I believe that this afternoon you're all going to a, what? 12. Okay, you're going to a matzah baking factory, which will be a hand made matzahs. So just to make sure you understand basically what goes on when you make matzahs, right? There is one guy who'll be in charge of a bowl with flour in. Another guy will be in charge of the water, right? The flour and water do not see each other or come anywhere near each other from the beginning. And there's a third person, right, who will be in charge of mixing the two together. He will receive from one and from the other. That way, the flour doesn't touch the water or get anywhere near the water until the clock starts ticking. Soon as the flour and water are mixed, there's somebody there with a stopwatch who starts to count the time, okay? The flour is then mixed by hand, okay? And then after it's thoroughly mixed so that all the flour is mixed in with the water and there's no flour left, it's all dough, it's passed on to some very, very strong people. This is the stage that needs very, very strong people because the dough that we make nowadays, Ashkenazim especially, is very hard to knead. Okay, it doesn't have very much water in it. The reason why it doesn't have very much water in it is so that the matzahs won't go moldy over Pesach and they can be made before Pesach and not have to be remade during Pesach, okay? And they're actually, some of them are made from months and months before, but that's not the point. If you didn't have the consistency that we have today, then you would have to remake your matzahs on Pesach, and that would be halachically problematic. It's not forbidden, it's permitted, you're allowed to make matzahs on Pesach, but it's problematic, and that's why we avoid doing that. Because of that reason, the dough is very, very thick, it's very hard to knead. And if you make it like that, it's going to be very hard to chew, okay? Especially if you have false teeth, or don't have any teeth at all, right? And people who are ill, it's very, very difficult to chew what we call Ashkenazi hard matzahs. And therefore, we need people who have the strong to bash this dough into very, very thin matzahs that you're familiar with today. And then, with a little bit still difficult, you can chew on it and eventually swallow your matzahs and do the mitzvah and not break your teeth and not have a terrible stomachache during Pesach. So that's very important. You have very, very strong. Now, these people, very strong people, are also paid a lot of money, right? Because you can't find very strong people, you and I are not, I'm not, right? And therefore, these people are paid a lot of money, which makes the hand matzahs very expensive. Okay? And then the matzahs are then given to someone who's at the end of a table. He continues to work at it. He takes off small slices with a sharp knife. He passes them to the person in front of him, one on his left, one on his right. And that person starts to roll them with his hands. And then he passes it after he started to roll it to the next person. And that person will continue to do that. Eventually, it will get to someone who has a rolling pin and he will start making it thinner and he'll pass it on to something else with a rolling pin. It will go down the table until the person at the end, he's one of the experts who's paid a lot of money, right? Because he's the one who knows exactly how thin to make it and how big to make it. So it shouldn't be too thick and be hard to eat. It shouldn't be too thin and get burnt when it goes in the oven. Okay, those are the guys at the end of the row. There's two guys on the end of the table, and they pass it on to a person who's going to make the holes in the matzah, and he does that very, very quickly. There's usually one person making the holes. Even though there's two rows of matzahs, there's one person making holes, and then like one or two matzahs, and then that's all in one room. In a separate room with a small window usually, there's somebody who is working in the oven room. The reason why it's a small window, because we don't want any of the heat, which is in the oven, to come into the room where the matzahs are. Because these matzahs are starting to be worked on. They're already 2 or 3 minutes into the process, and they could then be affected by the heat of the oven, start to rise instead of starting to bake. Okay, we don't want them to rise; we want them to bake very quickly. So there's a very small window in which a stick is passed through. The two matzahs are placed on. Then the baker puts them in the oven. They're usually in the oven for about 15 to 30 seconds. And then they come out and they're already baked. That's how hot the oven is. That is a hand-baking matzah machine, and that's how it was always done since the times of Moshe Rabbeinu till the year 1839. Okay, that's where we start with machine matzahs. Okay, now you can see a picture of what the original machine. I don't think there's any photos of the original machines, right? This is a drawing of the original. This is actually from America, right? You can see what it was. All it was a machine that basically did that job of those very strong people. So it was a machine which you turned with a handle, right? They were put between heavy weights, okay, and that could squash this tough matzah material into thin dough without needing these big muscular, often goyim, who would be squashing the matzah. These machines also made the holes. You can't see it so well in the picture. You sort of can, right? But the holes which are needed, you need holes. If you don't have a matzah with the holes, it will become chametz because it just will blow up with the heat. You have to have the holes in the matzah, and that machine did that. And then everything else was the same. That means the process before this, which is mixing the flour and water and mixing it into a dough, was done exactly as it always been done. The process after this, which was taking it from this to putting it in the oven, and the oven were exactly identical. The only processes which were done by machine, right, was the squashing of the piece of dough that has already been made into a matzah size, squashing it through the rollers and making the holes in it. That was the original machine, which was invented, as you'll see in the notes, by a fellow called Isaac Singer in the year 1838. He was a French person, and his machine became well spread through France, through Germany, in England. Eventually it came to Hungary and was used by hundreds of thousands of Jews, the matzahs that were produced by this machine, without any controversy. Okay, until the year, 20 years later, in the year 1859, when a controversy broke out in Poland over the use of this machine. Okay, now, just to get an idea of the I don't know the right word to use, acrimony, I don't know if that's the right word, or the strength that people felt about this, I've printed here 2 letters, one from Reb Chaim Tzanzer, right? Reb Chaim Halberstam, who wrote a book called the Divrei Chaim. You may have heard of Tzanz, Kiryat Tzanz, in Netanya, Kiryat Tzanz. That's a group of Hasidim, okay? Who the founder of this dynasty was Reb Chaim Tzanzer, okay? He wrote a letter, right? He lived in Galicia, and he wrote a letter against. Now, the controversy didn't start with him, okay? The controversy started with a rabbi called Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. Rabbi Kluger was a rabbi of a place called Brody. And he was opposed to the use of the machine. Came to Poland, right, from Germany and France, and he was opposed to the use of this machine on several grounds that we'll talk about in a second. After he gave his halachic opinion on why he thought this should not be used, it was backed by Reb Chaim Tzanzer and Chidush Arim, whose name is Yitzchak Meir Alter, who was the founder of the Gur dynasty of Hasidim. Right? Today you have what's called Ger or Gur. You have the Sfas Emes, who was the Chidush Arim's grandson, and the Imre Emes, and the Beis Yisrael, and many great rebbes of Gur. He was the founder of this dynasty, and he also came out. He lived in Warsaw. He was also very much opposed. Just to get an idea of their opposition, I've printed these letters, right? In one of them it says that the first, I know it's the first one, the one which is like shorter, right? That's from the Chidush Arim, Yitzchak Meir of Varsha, and he says like this, just take one line out of it. He says, I'll read it in Hebrew, Sha'altem oidos asiyas hamatzos l'chag Pesach al-yedei machine, that's what it's called, machine, mem, aleph, shin, yud, nun, that's they knew it as machine matzahs. Hagam, ki lo ra'isiya ma'olam, it's true, I've never seen this machine, which is a little bit problematic, right? The Chidush Arim hadn't seen the machine matzahs. However, from the letter of Rabbi Mordechai Zev of Lviv is what we call in English Lemberg, that's the Jewish way of saying Lemberg, Hineni maskim, I agree to forbid it based on his correct words. Hashem should save his people from those messengers of the Yetzer Hara, disciples of Yeravam ben Nevat. Now, those who have learned Navi will know what that means, right? Yeravam ben Nevat was the one who caused the northern kingdom of Israel to sin over periods of hundreds of years and eventually was sent into exile. So this is a very, very strong comment, okay, of anybody to make, right? These people who are introducing this new machine matzahs, all right, are disciples, messengers of the evil inclination and the students of Yerom ben Nevat in order to eat away from all mitzvahs a little by little. And their intention is to uproot the whole thing, as can be seen clearly from their actions. Hashem should break their thoughts and their plans shouldn't be established. And then he says, you should print this thing and whatever. Then he says, he agrees with Rabbi Shlomo Kruger from Brody, who was, like we said, he was the rabbinic authority who decided that the machine matzahs should not be produced. It's the letter of the Chedush Harim. You can get an idea of his strong opposition to it. Even stronger than that are the words of the Divrei Chaim. That's this called Chaim Halberstam, who was a Rav of Tzanz, who was also a very, very great tzaddik. I'm the first rabbi also was. Again, you could read the whole thing if you want, but the point is, he says that the opponents are correct, even though you could disagree with some of their points, he says, but they're still correct, and there's many, the pieces of matzah, of dough, get stuck to the machines. He talks a little bit about the problems, and there are other problems that will come from this machine. And there are other reasons why I think this is forbidden, which I withhold from disclosing, as have been taught by my father-in-law, that in this type of matter, you don't explain reasons, right? You just say it's forbidden, and you expect people to listen. There are certain, Ramosha Feinstein says the same thing about heart transplants, whatever, right? So, certain areas that's are so important that when you start giving reasons for things, well, yeah, it doesn't really apply, and my machine's different, right? And there are so many other reasons that the plebs, that's that word, the Hamoin Am don't understand, and therefore it's better you just tell everyone that's forbidden. So those who will listen. Of course, those who are not interested in listening won't listen. But the point is that he knows that people will listen to him, it's better not to explain the reasons. And then he says, listen, they're right in the middle. Absolutely. In order to matzahs with this machine, it's chometz gomor. Okay, now, somebody told me a funny story yesterday that his parents used to live in Netanya, which is where Kiryat Tzanz is today, right? There's a community of Hasidei Tzanz, and there, if you want to rent an apartment over Pesach, you have to sign a rental agreement that you will not bring machine matzahs into your house. Means you're renting from a Tzanz Chosid, right? You have to sign that you will not bring machine matzahs into the house. So he told me about a Litvish guy, right, who, I'm not going to eat machine matzahs. He kept his machine matzahs in his car, and whenever he wanted to eat his matzahs, he went in his car to eat his matzahs. That's how literally people take, and that's the Rebbe writes, it's chometz gomor. He wasn't making an exaggeration. He wasn't trying to scare people. He was trying to tell you, this is what I believe, it's chometz gomor. Well, if it's chometz gomor, then then you can't bring it into my house. Although that's not really true, because once you're renting it to somebody else, even if it really is chametz gomor, technically it should be okay. But whatever, that was the thing. You know, I have a Hasidic brother-in-law who, you know, it's forbidden to eat matzahs on Erev Pesach. It's forbidden to eat chametz on Erev Pesach. But on the day before Pesach, in the morning, you're not allowed to eat matzah either, right? It's a rabbinic decree to make sure that you have it when you eat matzahs in the evening. You'll do it when you are hungry. Hungry is not the right word, because you don't have to be hungry. You can fill yourself up on... No, not peckish. So that you should deal with leteovim, which means you should have a... What's the word? Excited. You know, I've not had matzahs for so long, right? Oh, but if you already had matzahs in the morning, it's not really exciting, okay? So my brother-in-law, eats machine matzahs on Erev Pesach in the morning. Why? Rabbi Chaim Sanzer says it's chometz gomor. So if I could eat bread in the morning, why can't I eat machine matzahs? It's just as bad. I'm just telling you how far certain people take this attitude of they will not allow it in their house. Somebody, the students in the kollel said he once took his own spelt. He only eats spelt matzahs. He took his spelt machine matzahs to Seder night. He didn't realize that he was going to a Tzanz Chosid for Seder night. And when he came into the house, he said, "Excuse me, please leave them outside the door." Understand? That's how the thing. On the other hand, the rabbis who supported it, like Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanzon, who actually was a brother-in-law of the Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. So he had two brothers-in-law, lived at the same time. He was a rabbi in Lemberg, which is Lvov in Poland, and the other rabbi was a rabbi in Brody. And he very, very forcefully came out for machine matzahs, right? And we'll see exactly what the sides of the debate are very briefly and as we go through. Okay, so let's just give an idea of what's going on over here. All right, so if you turn to the page of the notes, we'll read it together. With the popularization of the machine, a major halachic controversy broke out over the kosher status of machine matzah. The controversy erupted in 1859 when Rabbi Shlomo Kluger of Brody came out in opposition to machine matzah. Great rabbis of the era who opposed machine matzahs included Chidushei Harim and the Divrei Chaim, who we just mentioned their short letters. Equally great personalities, mostly from Central and Western Europe, right? Most of those who were for the machine were from France and in Germany, as opposed to Poland. Not entirely, but that's how it mostly was. Of course, the Rabbi Natanzon, who was a rabbi of Lemberg, was from Poland, and we'll see others from Eastern Europe as well. But that was generally the divide, whether it was Western and as opposed to Eastern Europe. We'll see why in a second. Equally great personalities from Central and Western Europe maintained that machine matzahs were actually more kosher than handmade matzahs, right? Not just that they were okay, but they were actually better, even more, not just tastier or more hygienic, right? Or cheaper. They were actually more kosher, right? It was better to use machine matzahs than handmade. So here you have a very serious major debate. Is it better or forbidden to use machine matzahs, or is it better to use machine matzahs? Okay. These included Rabbi Natanzon of Lemberg, the Kesav Sofer, right? The Chassam Sofer was not alive anymore. It'd be interesting to know what the Chassam Sofer would have said about this. But the Chassam Sofer's son, right, who originally was opposed to it, but after seeing and checking the machines, he also gave his approval. The Aruch LeNer, that's Rabbi Ettlinger from Altona. As the matzah baking machine spread to other parts of the Jewish world, many great rabbinic personalities from Lithuania and Jerusalem, again, we're not talking about in Poland, as it spread to Lithuania, it spread to Jerusalem, there's great rabbis there also approved of it and even preferred machine matzahs. Rabbi Shmuel Salant, who was a rabbi in Jerusalem for about 70 years, Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Aaron Kotler's uncle, Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Epstein, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Hebron, and more recently Rabbi Yaakov Fisher, who was one of the rabbis of the Eder Charedis in Yerushalayim. Some of these rabbis would only use machine matzahs. Not that they held that hand matzahs were forbidden to use, because clearly Moshe Rabbeinu used hand matzahs, right? But once they had machine matzahs, which they felt were more kosher, so they said, well, why, let's use these. They're much better than the machine matzahs, the hand matzahs which have been made up till now, and therefore why not do the best? And there were many rabbis who insisted on only using machine matzahs. Okay, so here we've got some rabbis who will only use machine matzahs, even on the first night of Pesach, which we'll talk about soon, right? Will only use machine matzahs, right? And some rabbis will only use hand matzahs and wouldn't even allow machine matzahs in the house, right? In our time, Rav Shach, who was a famous Rosh Yeshiva of Panovich, reported the rabbis of Lithuania only use machine matzahs. Rabbi Yashiv ruled that someone whose minig is to use machine matzahs should continue doing it. Lechatchila, there's absolutely no problem if that's what your minig is. If your custom is to use hand matzahs, use hand matzahs. If your custom is to use machine matzahs, use machine matzahs. If you don't have a custom, right, then you'll have to decide yourself what you want to do. Okay? As I said, I'm not a halachic ruler. I'm just giving you a little bit of general knowledge. Yes?
What if your family bought both? Does it matter?
Well, like I say, no one thinks that hand matzahs are forbidden to use. Right? So you're allowed to use hand matzahs. Some people think that hand matzahs are not as good. It's not mehuda, because it's not as tasty, and therefore it's part of the hidur mitzvah, to beautify the mitzvah, to have matzahs which taste nicer, right? It's also matzahs which are more hygienic, because they've not had touched people's hands. It's also an advantage that they're cheaper. Instead of wasting your money on hand matzahs, which will cost you 160 shekel at least a kilo, right? You can pay 35 shekel for matzahs and give the rest of the money to stocker. So why waste your money on matzahs which are not better? In actual fact, they're worse. You know, those are all I'm not trying to take sides over here. I'm just saying those are the calculations that yeah. Okay. So let's see the major points. See what we've got time to discuss the major points. The first one is halachic issue, right? Which is, since the machinery consisted of many small parts, it was impossible to clean it adequately. That was the argument of the opponents. Dough remnants would potentially become chametz. That means bits of dough which were stuck in the machine, right? After, we've talked about that watch that's still ticking, right? After 18 minutes, everyone stops working, and all the matzahs which are still being worked are put aside. They're actually still baked, but they're usually put aside and sold to people who are okay to have matzahs which are after the 18. But that's how it usually is. 18 minutes from when the flour touches the water, then the matzahs are then, those are like the best matzahs, those which were baked within the first 18 minutes, and any dough, and then everything's washed, and people's fingers are washed, and then nails are washed, and the surfaces are scrubbed, and everything's cleaned, right? In a machine factory, it's harder to clean. Right? It's easier to clean in between the nails than it is to clean in the screws of the machines, and that was the opposition, one of the oppositions, because those bits of matzahs would then fall off the machines into the next dough, and then make those matzahs possibly into chametz. Possibly not, possibly yeah. If it's done before Pesach, it's easier, but those were one of the problems, okay? There was also concern that if the machine matzah was made in the traditional round shape, because that's how matzahs were traditionally made, okay? If they were made like that, apparently, I don't know why, but apparently the machines naturally made them square, right? The machines were not designed to make round matzahs, they were designed to make square matzahs. If you would then want to make your square matzahs round, you would then have to cut around the square to make it into round. And those bits, well, no one's going to waste those bits, you know, it's not the 21st century, just throw things away. Then they would naturally have been put back into the dough, right? And that would be more problematic because then those pieces would like stay longer before they would actually end up in the oven, right? It could, theoretically, it would happen on a second round as well. It would also be the same piece that was stuck off, and therefore that was a bit of a problem that the parts that would make the dough round, right, would be used again in the next batch. Okay, so that would be a second problem. Here again, there was fear that these pieces become a chametz before being returned to the dough. In addition, the opponents claimed that the machinery became warm during the strenuous turning process. Okay, because you have these wheels which are doing this, usually you have a person banging there, right? Okay, but here you've got a wheel which is doing all the work on its own. So the heat generated by this friction was going to warm up the metal rods, and when it's warm, it makes the dough warm. Once the dough gets warm, instead of being baked, it rises. That's what happens. When the dough is warm, it rises. When it's put in the oven, it bakes. We don't want it to rise before it bakes. So if you do the process that Chazal talked about, which is the way it was done since Moshe Rabbeinu, okay, so that's okay. We know that's okay. That's always been done. Once you start inventing new things, which can be measured that the temperature is slightly higher, then that might be problematic. That's the major halachic issues with the matzah being chametz, right? That maybe as a result of that, there's, like we said, there's bits left in the machine, there's bits that are cut off and then put back into the dough, and the machinery is warmed up. Okay, we're talking about in 1859, right? It's over 180 years ago, approximately 170 years ago, where things have changed since then, but if we have time, we'll talk about what's today, but that's how it was then. Okay. The defenders of the machine maintained to the contrary. A machine is easier to clean than the equipment used for hand matzahs, such as rolling pins and even human hands. Okay? Rolling pins, if they're made of metal, very, very smooth metal, which is what's done today, then it's not a problem to clean them. But in those days, they used wooden rolling pins, right? And wooden pins get scratched and they get chipped. And therefore, they claim it's actually harder to clean the metal in the machines than it is to clean rolling pins and underneath your nails, so that you can, that's part of the debate, whether it's easier or harder to clean your nails or it is to clean the nails in the machine, the screws in the machine. Okay. These matzahs would then be more kosher, right? Because it's easier to clean the parts in their argument. They would be more hygienic, right? That's what I mean healthier, because they wouldn't have everyone's germs, which were in their hands, which try to clean them, but there's more germs in people's hands. The rabbis did concede that round-shaped matzahs might lead to problems, as we mentioned beforehand, because the bits that are cut off will be put back in, and therefore they determined that machine matzahs should be square-shaped, which is the reason why machine matzahs are square-shaped to this day, because if you want to make them round, you have to cut off the bits, and then you will probably use those bits over again. This led to a counter-argument that matzahs should be round, If you're going to make them square to avoid putting the pieces in, how can you have square matzahs? That's such a goyish matzah. Who makes square matzahs? Only goyim make square matzahs. Jews make round matzahs. So I'm talking about in 1859, no Jew had ever seen, right, in his house a square matzah. Maybe goyim do in the church, and I know what they have there, their wafers, which they put under their tongue, and I don't know what they do over there, right? But those are goyish matzahs. That's such a goyish thing to have square matzahs, and therefore, today it's become Jewish, okay? So that's how you associate it, but in those days, it was a goyish thing. And therefore, and not only that, when the Torah describes the matzahs, it calls them ugais matzahs. This is what the Torah says. What is an uga? Uga means, we say an uga means a cake, and uga actually means a circle, right? You have chayne ha-ma'agel. So it says ugloi uga. He made a circle. He didn't mean he made a cake, right? The rabbi who turned a circle until it rained, right? So to make a circle is an uga, right? So it's true, we say the word uga means a cake, but the root of the word uga means a circle. Right? So therefore, you see, the Torah expects matzahs to be round, and therefore that's the counter argument. You want to make them square to avoid the problem of the cutting off the bits. On the other hand, you should make them round because that's the Jewish way of doing it. If you make them square, that's called ubechukaiseyem loisei leichu. Right? That's a goyish custom. So just like we don't wear goyish clothes and we don't do things, we don't have Christmas trees on Shavuos in our shuls, right? We don't have square matzahs because that's the thing they have in the church, and it's not what you have in your seder. But this was the argument. If you want to make them round, then you get into a more halachic problem, which is you're going to cut off the pieces and then you're going to use them again, and that's more of a chometz issue. Okay. That was the original argument. Okay. The second argument was a socioeconomic problem, which is many poor families depended on the matzah bakery for their livelihood. They were the ones who were hired to do all this very hard bashing. Okay? And that brought them a very, very much needed income. Pesach time is a very expensive time of the year because you have to buy matzahs, which are 160 shekel a kilo, right? And so how am we going to get money to buy our matzahs? So we get hired by the matzah bakery. If you've got this guy sitting there with this wheel, right? One guy who can do all the job, so it's taking everybody else's parnassa away. Now, those who've learned history know this was the argument of the Luddites, right? Who smashed the spinning jenny. You never learned in British history, you don't know. Okay, the original spinning machines, there were riots because people assumed this is going to take our jobs away. And they were right, it really was taking people's jobs away because, one machine could do it took hundreds of people to work out. Okay, and whenever there's, innovation like that, there are people opposed to it. The same thing today, you go to the supermarkets, right, and you check out. You don't need the guys that check out, you do it on your own. Okay, that's just the way innovation works. But that was one of Rabbi Shlomo Kluger's concern, that we have to worry about the people's, especially the poor people's parnassa when it comes to Pesach time, which will be taken away by introducing the machines. Okay? The defenders responded that such an argument was not valid. It's just, that's not a rabbinic concern. I mean, it is a concern, but that's not a reason not to use matzahs which are actually, people have the right to make matzahs which are cheaper, which are tastier, which are more kosher. And the fact that you're concerned for poor people is a very important concern, but give them tzedakah from the tzedakah fund. Now, that's not a reason, that's not the way halacha works, that we change the halachic ruling in order to that was a major debate. You have to understand that every point of these things, I'm just saying it very, very, very briefly. Right? There's long pages and pages to discuss and bring a proof from the Gemara. We do have to be concerned about poor people, like, for example, that we don't read the Megillah on Purim, on Shabbos. Why don't we read the Megillah on Shabbos? One of the reasons is because when the poor people hear the Megillah, they get excited. Oh, soon we're going to get our money, right? Matanas lev yonim. And on Shabbos, no one's going to give them anything. So they're going to be all upset. So that's one of the reasons why we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos, It's brought in the Gemara, says that. I didn't make that a reason. It says in the Gemara. So you see, this is what Shlomo Kluger says. You see, we do make halachic amendment and not read the Megillah on Shabbos, even though it's the right day and it says in the Torah you're supposed to read the Megillah because of our economic concerns about the poor people. So that's a lot of it. Is it really the same? Is it really different? As you know, in all Talmudic debate, it goes on and on and on forever, right? And but that was the. But they also argued that this production makes the matzahs much cheaper. Right? As it does, as you know, right? You can buy matzahs, even the chabure matzahs, right? Cost 50, 60 shekel a kilo, nowhere near the price of the basic hand matzahs, which are at least 2, even 3, 4 times the price of machine matzahs. So these poor people who need more money for Pesach time, right? They won't need so much more if the matzahs are much cheaper. So that's also a consideration, the same economic consideration to help them by giving them a job will be to use machine matzahs and make the Pesach expenses much less. Okay. That's the second point. Okay. Let's move to the fourth point. I think we should have mentioned the fourth point first, which is the mitzvah observance, which is, Even if there's no problem with the kashrus of the matzah, right? And they're kosher, no problem, even more kosher. Let's say for argument's sake, they're more kosher. There's another problem, which is on the first night of Pesach, there is a halacha that you have to have, this is the way we paskin, the matzahs have to be made lishma, right? Just like you make tefillin lishma, means the person making them must have in mind that he's doing it for the purpose. This will be used for the mitzvah. When you make the tzitzis, they must be spun lishma, right? And so the same as when you make matzahs. When you knead the dough and you roll the dough and you make the holes in the dough and you put it in the oven, every stage of the thing will go to the matzah making and say, L'shem matzah's mitzvah, L'shem matzah's mitzvah, matzah no even around, right? That everyone is reminding themselves, and there'll be big notices on the wall, that everything we do today is the L'shem matzah's mitzvah. The question is, can a machine have a kavanah L'shem matzah's mitzvah? So obviously a machine can't, right? But can the person pulling the wheel round, is he pushing the wheel around L'shem, is that good enough, right? So the opponent said, that's not called lishma. Lishma means what you're doing with your own force, that's lishma. The other rabbi says, what's the difference between a rolling pin? Rolling pin is also a machine, right? You know, you're not squashing the mat, so the rolling pin is, but you put your force in the rolling pin, and that's good enough, right? So if you take a wheel and you go around like this, and the mats has come through and squashed, it should be the same. Again, that's a tremendous discussion. Those who know, it's a discussion of koichai and koyach, and the sugyas in Baba Kama, the sugyas in Sanhedrin. What is called an action? What's not called an action? And do you need lishma? Again, I say the sugyas go on and on and on, but that's the basic second point. Even if the matzahs are not chametz and they're absolutely fine, even better as far as the kashrus is concerned, as far as they're considered matzahs, but the problem is using on the first night of Pesach because maybe it's not considered lishma. But again, the argument is there's no difference between a machine and a rolling pin is also a machine. And just like a rolling pin, you can use lishma. So the same will be with the machines as they were. Okay, that's the third point. Okay? The fourth point is hashkafik, which is, and this if you read between the lines of the Divrei Chaim and the Chidush Harim, you'll see that it wasn't really the chametz issue that bothered them. What was bothering was the reform movement. Now, we're living in 1850, right? The reform movement, which started in the late 18th century, has wreaked havoc to the Jewish world of Europe, right? Destroyed communities that had existed for 500, 600, 700 years, like Frankfurt, right? When Rabbi Aish came to Frankfurt in the early 1800s, right? He just about managed to find a minyan, right? The same Frankfurt where the Pnei Yeshua had been the rabbi 100 years beforehand. And great rabbis had been rabbis in Frankfurt for many, the Shlach Kodesh, right? 50 years beforehand, right? All of a sudden, there's no mikveh, there's no kosher meat, right? It's like shocking what happened. So now, let's read it together. Yeah? A most interesting objection against the machine did not concern the machine itself, but the innovation in general. The argument went as follows. Innovation, even if halachically defensible, should be avoided, as one change leads to another. Eventually, serious changes would be made in Jewish life and mitzvah observance. Now, you may think that's a convoluted concern, right? Because you live in the 21st century, right? If you lived in the 1830s and 1840s, you may think as follows. Think of the introduction of the organ into the synagogue. Organ meaning, right? Wearing of canonicals by rabbis. What are canonicals? You know what they are? The sort of hats that they wear in the church. Same as the Protestant clergy. Those are called canonicals. The use of the German language for the sermon, right? Which was unheard of in the 17th century, 18th century, right? In the early 19th century, the rabbis started to speak German. And not Yiddish. Not Yiddish. Yiddish was for the Chassidim of Galicia, right? German. These were introductions, all of which were technically halachically sound. There's nothing wrong with playing an organ in a synagogue. There's nothing wrong with wearing Protestant-looking canonicals. There's nothing wrong with speaking German in your sermon. There's nothing wrong. But when you think again of mixed seating in the synagogue, the omission of any reference to the return to Tzion and Yerushalayim and to the sacrificial service from the prayers, all of which were well-established customs of the reform movement by the 1850s, right? All of which are forbidden, but not serious offenses, right? Not the end of the world that you take out of your prayers any reference to the sacrifices. It may be wrong, right? But it's not the end of the world. And then you think again of intermarriage and apostasy, which were the consequence of this whole movement. You can then see the path that Reformed Judaism led the Jewish people in the early 19th centuries to religious and national oblivion. And now you can understand that the rabbis of Galicia are really concerned because this is an innovation. It's true. It's not an innovation which is halakhically forbidden, right? But you can see where this is leading to. So the rabbis in Germany and in France, whose communities had already been destroyed by Reform Judaism, right? They didn't oppose the innovation of machine matzah. Big deal. You know what? Our communities have already been destroyed by modernization. So we're trying to save whatever we can, which is why even Rabbi Aish, for example, introduced German as the language of his sermons. Very, very high level German, right? Because you understand the picture was exactly the opposite. They were trying to bring people back. They wanted to do Kirov, the rabbis of France and Germany, right? So for them, machine matzahs was great. Was it people who may not eat matzahs because got people's fingers in them, right? And it's expensive, so making the matzahs more hygienic and tastier and cheaper was a good kirov tool, which is what these rabbis were involved. The rabbis in Galicia were trying to defend their communities from reform. That means reform hadn't managed to do anything in Galicia or in Poland in a big way. So those rabbis were exactly the opposite. They were trying to prevent all these things that reform had destroyed over the years from starting off by making machine. There's nothing wrong with machine matzahs. Even if there's nothing wrong with machine matzahs, it's an innovation. One innovation leads to another, as they had experienced over the past 50, 100 years in Western Europe. So that's why, again, it's not a hard and fast rule, because clearly Rabbi Nathanson was not in Germany, not in France. He was in Galicia, just like his brother-in-law was in Lemberg, in Brody. But the general picture is the rabbis who were concerned about defending their communities from innovation were the ones who opposed the machine matzahs, and those who either weren't concerned, right, or better said, had much more important concerns in their community, right? In actual fact, the concern was in the opposite direction, right, was to bring these people back into the fold and to make sure, right? So they had the opposite considerations, and that's really, when you feel between the lines, that's really what's going on over here. Okay, I think we have to stop here because I believe I was told to stop at 12 o'clock. So really the question is whether, we have to then discuss, are things better now or are they worse? That means those who want to eat machine matzahs like I do, and like all my family do, and like all your families do, right? Can we just rely? Sorry, not everybody's does. Okay, yeah. Can we rely on the opinions of Rabbi Nathanson and the Aruch LaNer and the Ksav Sofer, which are great, amazing, Rabbi Yasher Rishach, are all these, you know, the Shmuel Salant, are our matzahs better than their matzahs, or are our matzahs worse than their matzahs? So generally, if you ask out in the street, everyone says, look, you see these machines, you can see why those machines were difficult to clean, right? And why the Reb Chaim Sanzer says it's Chametz Gomel, right? And why the Chidush Harim says this is the Talmidim of Yeshua, what's his name? Yerovam ben Nevat, right? But today, sparkling, stainless clean, you'll see if you ever go to a machine, right? Clean, with amazing machines, air pressure that cleans all these machines. Ours are 1,000 times better than those. That's one argument, okay? In actual fact, I believe that the arguments are actually the opposite, right? That even those who once allowed machine matzahs would be very hesitant to allow many machine matzahs today, which is what the rest of this year is about. We don't have a time, so you can read it yourself, right? On all the problems with today's machine matzahs. You see, basically, what's changed is there's no manpower, it's all electricity. Right? So just because turning this L'Shem Matzah's mitzvah is good, doing this L'Shem Matzah's mitzvah, all you do is press the button, right? And all the machine works on its own. Who says that's the same thing? You could argue it is, you could argue it's not, but he certainly can't assume that all those rabbis who would allow that process would allow our process. But that only makes a problem on the first night. It doesn't make them into chametz, it just means they're not usable for the first night of Pesach, which is when you need the matzahs which are made with the right kavanah. That's one problem. The other problem is today, the whole process is done by machine, right? It's not just this small process in the middle. The earlier process, which is the mixing of the flour and water, are also done by machine in enormous amounts, much, much bigger than it used to be, right? Like 15 kilo of flour is put together. Now, when you have enormous amounts like that, you have to have very, very big machines to mix them. The bigger the machine, the more power, the more heat is generated, which makes a problem. The other major problem is the fact that the end process is also done by machine. In those days, they had exactly the same ovens as the handmade matzahs. It was the same ovens, it was just the middle process that was done by machine, wasn't even really a machine, right? Today, we have ovens which do not heat to the same temperature, right? The ovens take 2 minutes for the matzahs to go through. The ovens are only 400 degrees Celsius as opposed to like 700. So in hand factories, the matzahs are in there for about 15 seconds, 30 seconds maximum. In the machine matzahs, they are like for 2-3 minutes. And therefore, to cut a long story short, even those who use hand matzahs, machine matzahs, are try and get what's called chabura matzahs. Chabura matzahs are much more mahuda, which means they try to solve all the problems that have been generated by the process which we have today. And also those who do eat machine matzahs, many will eat machine matzahs but still use hand matzahs for the first night because the argument that maybe electricity, pressing a button, isn't the same thing as turning a wheel, and therefore you've still got the problem of kavana. Okay? Have a great Yom Tov, and you should have a Chag Kosher V'Sameach.